first and the most obvious is going to be the Glacian Empire, although on the map, as you can see, and these days it's known as the Terran Empire. The Glacian Empire is probably the oldest sovereignty in existence. However, its sovereignty is not necessarily wholly continuous. In other words, there was a time when Glacia was preoccupied, let's say, and the tribes of frost giants that she oversaw were mostly leaderless. So their main ruler was gone, but they were still around. Glacia's domain is, again, thousands of years old. The newest iteration of it, the Glacian Empire, which turned into the Terran Empire about 15 years ago, that was founded about 800 years ago, 600 to 800 years ago, in which they started their ways of raiding and slaving all throughout the Horseshoe Plains again. So the ruler of the Terran Empire, as we've talked about previously, was Glacia. When it was the Glacian Empire, she was the sole ruler. That was that, right? She didn't really split things up, at least not for a long time. After a humiliating defeat to the Vahi navies, which was engineered by the creators, myself, of Glacia. I didn't go in there thinking, oh, I'm going to win this naval battle. No, I set Glacia up to lose. So she goes into this naval battle against the Vahi, and she loses, embarrassing, right? An embarrassing loss. After that, she contacts the Nerak, who are a warlike, aggressive, aquatic race, a sub-race of the Nair. And they worship strength and power and honor and conquest more than we're worshiping Longma, right? So Vesh'ta sees, not Vesh'ta, she just did it again, Glacia sees an opportunity, and she contacts the Nerak and hires them more or less to build and maintain a fleet for her, and creates her navy almost entirely out of Nerak sailors. There's still some humans and everything like that, but she puts an incredible amount of trust in a naval commander called Sablekk. He eventually rises to the rank of High Admiral, earns Glacia's trust not only for his effectiveness, but also for his single-minded, devoted, almost blind loyalty, right? He knows that's how you get ahead, right? He's used to serving dragons, serve one dragon, serve another dragon. So he does very well under Glacia and kind of carves out for himself control of the Navy. And it gets to the point where, Glacia would never openly admit it, and neither would anyone else because you don't get eaten by the dragon. But Sablekk could rival her supremacy if he ever had that idea in his head. If, before the Glacian Empire was ended and the peace was founded, he ever decided, you know what, civil war, I want a larger chunk of this pie, he could very easily become more than just a thorn in Glacia's side, but he could become a serious threat to her power. But he never made any sort of movements for that. He's clearly an ambitious character, but he has his own enemies, and honestly, I think he's content with control of the sea. If he's going to control the land, it will be because he sees a threat to his province and his domain in the sea from within the empire itself, which might be coming around the corner. Anyways, so this rulership style continues for some time, until, and we'll start talking about her now. The next one kind of on our list here is Vesh'ta. We've mentioned her a lot before. This area up to the north here, the Grand Tier Peninsula, which is currently named Flasan's province. That, since time immemorial, was owned by an ice witch named Vesh'ta. Now, Vesh'ta was content with ruling over her province there, the peninsula. She didn't really care to expand much. When her subjects began to flee across the mountains to the south, she let them go. So she's not obsessed with conquest like a lot of the other more authoritarian rulers of Atheros. But she was still an authoritarian ruler, right? She saw the human races as lesser, much lesser, right? She herself had created the Vesh'tans as, weaker facsimiles of herself. And the humans are these mundane, like they're not even born magical, just like monkeys, right? Like she looks down her nose immensely at humans. But towards the mid-Third Era, both Vesh'ta and Glacia were starting to understand the threat that humanity represented. They were starting to control more and more territory in the Central Horseshoe Plains. And because of how fast they bred, if they weren't subjugated and kept under control, they were going to be a problem, right? So for a time, Vesh'ta and Glacia did join forces, and they were quite successful until inevitably they turned on each other, right? Vesh'ta was the weaker partner, and she was eventually taken out. She was the rightful ruler of the Grand Tier Peninsula for thousands of years, but as of about 20 years ago, after a series of assassination attempts, she was put, quote-unquote, on ice. So Vesh'ta, again, talking about one of the rulers, she's also an avatar, the former ruler of the Grand Tier Peninsula, and by all rights, the rightful ruler, because she's still alive, she's just on ice, is currently frozen in a cryogenic freeze, more or less. And she's being held by the Bork. Now, I mentioned it before that Glacia and Vesh'ta entered into an alliance. When Vesh'ta became indisposed, Glacia absorbed her territories and placed the dragon Flasan in charge of it. Now, Flasan was a bit of a rival to Vesh'ta's power. Actually, no, I don't think she placed Flasan in control. No, that's right, Varthus did. Glacia took control of the territory, but it wasn't for long, because it was shortly after that Glacia herself was killed by Covenant troops to the south. So within a short span of time, both Vesh'ta and Glacia are taken out. And all of this territory is left more or less rulerless, right? And there's this vacuum of power. Sablekk seems like a natural choice to step up and fill the vacuum, but for some reason, he doesn't seem to be leaping on the opportunity. Well, instead, there's a lieutenant who we haven't talked about much, but he did quite a bit before now. He was not just some no-name dude. There was an officer in Glacia's army called Varthus who had received much honor for his service to the state, and also for his political acumen as well. So after the death of Glacia, Varthus took control of the empire, and he did more or less three things that set the empire's current political agenda and stance, as far as him being the overall ruler of the Terran Empire. First, he ended the war. He ended the Forever War, right, with the entire continent. Glacia had a Forever War going with everybody, because according to her, she was the very first thing on the continent. Therefore, everything in Atheros belonged to her. That was the basis of all Glacian imperial doctrine up to that point. We are the rightful owners and rulers of the entire continent, and everybody else just doesn't realize it. They're misguided subjects that need to be brought back into the fold. So Varthus, he suspends this Forever War. It upsets a lot of the Frost Giant factions within the Empire, but they don't hold as much power as they used to. That's what happens when you enslave people over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries. They kind of start to outnumber you and gain a lot of power after some time. And that's what was happening in the Empire at this time. So Varthus sues for peace with the Bellhold, and then also with the Grand Covenant to the south here. He ceded some territory as well, and in doing so, changes the political landscape of the continent. Again, up until now, for hundreds of years, the entire continent was embroiled in war. Now that war was finally over, and a human was at the helm of the Glacian Empire. The second key thing that Varthas did that helped to set the Empire's current political agenda was to give out tribute, more or less. He said, part of ceding this territory to the Grand Covenant, Castle Blatt here, Glacia's old fortress capital, all of her treasure was there. All the treasure that she'd collected for thousands and thousands of years. And I mean, sure, she'd used some of that to pay her troops, but a great deal of that she had just been hoarding for generations upon generations, since time immemorial, right? So Varthas says, along with ceding this territory, we're going to open Glacia's vault, and we're going to give out reparations. So everyone, all the different people that are signing on to this peace treaty right now with the Empire, so you won't attack us, we won't attack you, sorry for all the slaving and everything, we're not going to do that anymore, we swear, or at least we're not going to take you people as slaves. We're still going to keep slaves ourselves, of course, but we're not going to come into your lands, we're not going to raid you, we're not going to take your stuff, we'll keep to ourselves, you keep to yourselves, and here's a payout, because we understand the dragon took a bunch of money from you guys over time. They made us do it. Look, we didn't want to do that. Why would we want to come into our brother's home and beat him up and take his money? We only did that because the dragon was making us, right? So it's this brilliant political maneuver by Varthas. He could have, going in there, tried to take up the reins of the Empire and commit them to this war with the entire continent, but instead he uses Glacia's death as an excuse to basically, like I said, change the entire tack of the Glacian Empire into what is now known as the Terran Empire. And this is not just a shrewd political move, but it's also an enormous one. I already talked for a moment about how, until now, Imperial doctrine was bent on forever war with the entire continent. Now it was not. Now it was based solely on just, instead, Imperial supremacy and winning through just Cold War, more or less. And that kind of ties into the third piece that Varthas did as ruler to set the current track of the Imperial political scheme. And that was to split Imperial territory up officially and say, Sablekk, you rule over these cities. And he called up Flasan and said, Flasan, you rule over these cities. So he actually split his power, which was something that Glacia never would have dreamed of. In doing so, he also concentrated the power of those areas. So basically saying, okay, in my province here, this is the Red Bull, we're going to focus on these things. Sablekk's province, we're going to focus on these things. In Flasan's province, we're going to focus on these things. So he kind of created sectors of the economy, which already existed to an extent, but he more or less put it on the fast track in order to shift the Imperial war machine to one of production and plenty instead. And they've been doing a bang-up job of that. They've been benefiting from the peace a lot more in the last 15 years than other places have. So that's more or less kind of what's going on with Varthas. I guess a bit to say about Varthas, because this is about the rulers and who he is, right? He has a long history of of service with the Imperial Army. He was initially a slave. He was a slave who was taken from the Bellhold. He was poor, homeless, broke out there. It didn't really have much going for him. And then he was taken as a slave. Okay, not that much better, but he realized, hey, at least I'm not going to bed hungry every night. Then, turns out, Glacia says, hey, we're opening up a slave legion, an opportunity for slaves to prove themselves and perhaps even earn their freedom. This seemed like an irresistible opportunity to Varthas, so he took it. And he, being a very ambitious guy, honestly, just baldly ambitious, right there on its face for everyone to see. He rose through the ranks of the Slave Legion fairly quickly, not only for his ambition, but also for his skill and so forth. So he leads the slave legion to a number of victories, earns his freedom, and earns a commission as an officer as well. Eventually is placed in charge of the airship fleet for the Empire. And the Empire only has 3 airships, right? Those are the only airships that exist in all of Atheros. I didn't want this to be like steampunk, fantasy, everything, right? I wanted it to be more like the limited Final Fantasy sort of thing, where it's like, it's one of the airships, da-da-da-da. So anyways, Varthus is commanding the airships one day, and during the attack, it's during, I believe it's the Siege of Vesh'ta. I think it's the first Siege of Vesh'ta. Or it might have been the first Siege of Grimming. No, I think it was the first Siege of Grimming. Is Vesh'ta? I think it was the first Siege of Grimming, because Vesh'ta, they just rode between the columns and bonked him on the head. I think it was the first Siege of Grimming. Yeah, it was the first Siege of Grimming. They attacked, and the airship was damaged and taken down. It crashed and fell. But again, there's only 3 of these airships. The reason there's only 3 is because there was this special meteorite that Thup created at one point to help wipe out an enemy that doesn't need to be discussed right now. The pieces of that meteorite were salvaged by the Imperials, and they used it as a power core. Kind of think of it like a nuclear core kind of thing, right? It's just superheating steam in a steam engine. Anyways, they use it as a power core for an airship. They only have enough material to make 3 of these power cores. 1, 2, 3. So they lose the power core, they lose the ability to make that airship. And the Akaika, they're no slouches when it comes to artifice, right? If they were able to procure that core from the crashed airship, they might be able to make their own airship, or 2 airships, who knows? So the airship crashes, and Varthus thinks, you know what? This core is more valuable than my life to the Empire. So he takes it, grabs it with his own. I mean, he's armored, but unprotected against immense amounts of radiation. And he carries it out. He falls. His men carry him and it out. And he's severely and brutally punished for his loss by Glacia. She tells him, if you lose and dishonor us like this again, I'm just going to execute you. But as it stands, you still have some use to me, so get out there and don't you lose again. So he says, all right. Obviously, his body is wrecked and racked in pain, and he can't do much with it. So he figures, you know what? I'm going to do the unthinkable. I'm going to ask someone for a favor. So he reaches out to the forge god Ahiatua, who by now, he knew, had been reborn and, in a way, corrupted as a god of war. Ahiatua now made these massive war machines that stalked the Central Plains, destroying nearly everything in their sight, right? They even opposing the Akaika. So that's one of the things that makes Varthus think this. Like, hey, Ahiatua makes the war machines that, even the Akaika fear. He might be willing to make something for me, because most people think like Varthus is well aware of his perception, or rather the perception that other people have of he and the Empire abroad. Not well liked. He's not dumb, right? He grew up in the Bellhold. He knows about those perceptions. He's not blind to them like a lot of Imperials are. But he thinks to himself, you know what, maybe Ahiatua will be willing to put that aside and do me a solid. And he not only does, but he powers it with one of what are called the Pearls of Ahiatua. They're these magical, you think of them more or less like the Dragon Balls is what the creator has called them. But they also can be considered in D&D terms like an artifact-level pearl of power, right? It's this constantly regenerating source of magical energy. So Varthus asks Ahiatua to make him a suit which will sustain his body and allow him to continue to serve in his capacity as an Imperial officer. And Ahiatua agrees, and he makes him that suit of armor powered by a pearl of Ahiatua. And not only that, but it's also powered by Varthus' own rage as well, because he's a pretty angry guy, but he's a lot angrier now, knowing that, his loss has utterly embarrassed him and has put his head on the executioner's block. And if he fails again, Like, that's it. He's dead, and he's not going to fail. He's not going to die. So he's empowered now by this new suit. He takes control of the army again, wins a great success at Grimming years later after a horrific psychological siege. And this is all while at the same time instituting new policies in the Empire as well, to make things more sustainable, let's say. Again, have less of a war-based economy based on raiding, and more of a agricultural and agrarian-based economy, and also, gasp, tax the imperial nobles. It's something that's not really thought of, like even considered, right? But taxes for the imperial nobles that would go to the army and not just Glacia, things like that are considered. Long story short, again, Varthus, he secures victory at Grimming, has another series of minor victories, and then when Glacia dies, he steps in and assumes that power vacuum. And he has immense support from within the Imperial army because of the victories that he's won. He has immense support within the populace because not only is he a human, which a great deal of the Imperial population is human by now, especially after they absorbed Vesh'ta's province to the north. He's also a slave that worked his way up. Like, he is the living embodiment of the imperial machine working, right? Like, Varthus' existence and his place at the top of the empire is an example that every imperial uses to say, we have slaves, well, we also have a slave emperor. So, like in your nations, the commoners, they could never hope to rise to the rank of, nobility, let alone royalty. Yeah, right. It's not going to happen. Royal marries a commoner, they're kicked out of the royal family, just like that. It doesn't happen, right? But here in the Empire, a slave can become the emperor if they are strong enough, if they have what it takes. So it's a meritocratic state, absolutely. And Varthus is kind of used as the example of that meritocracy in action. Look, he was a slave, and now he's our ruler because he brought us so much success, because he served loyally. And he will continue to be quite successful. The book of Varthus' legacy is only getting started. It will be a while before the Empire starts to lose momentum. We can talk about more of that later. So we talked briefly about Sablekk as well. Just a little bit more about him. He's in charge of the Imperial Navy. You can see that he has a very large swath of territory there. He effectively landlocks all of the Empire, with the exception of Boone there and Crater Lake, and also Adon in Flasan's province. But he controls, again, pretty much all of the Navy. Lenarask, as well, it should be noted, is an underwater city, as are Frost and Assail. Might be kind of obvious when cities are in the ocean, but just in case it's not. Sablekk himself, again, he's more, I said before, he's more content to rule his territory under the sea, but it's really more that he still has his own personal demons and enemies that he's fighting off and trying to secure before he feels comfortable taking the next step. There is another avatar, a creature called the Golden Endbringer, which he considers a rival to his power and a rival to his control and authority over the province. And more or less, the Golden Endbringer is, if you look into Greek myth, you see Bacchus, right? Like, oh, he's such a cool guy, but he's also the god of madness. And you see a little bit of that in what's going on here with Sablekk. He so tightly controls everything that eventually the people are driven mad and they can't control their own actions, right? It's the idea of control spiraling out of control. When you try to regulate people's actions so heavily, eventually they break down and all sense of control breaks down and they start doing whatever they want. And that can cause and incite temporary madness, and that's more or less what these instances of the Golden Endbringer are within the city. He will, or I think he did. I don't think it's happened yet. No, he did. Yeah, no, he doesn't have the Kaimonicon yet. I don't believe he does. I think Longma right now. Let me just do a quick.
What happened when he fought the Golden Emperor?
Yeah, I know. I'm saying. Do you remember when? Can you just look that up real quick? When he fought the Golden Endbringer. I don't remember if he's going to fight the Golden Endbringer in a couple of years or if he just finished fighting the Golden Endbringer. I think he might have just finished fighting it, and Long Ma is right now licking his wounds in the distance. But we're going to look that up really quick. So that's a bit more about Sablekk. Let's see here. So that's the initial attack. Keep going. Yeah. Keep going. Down one more. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. So it looks like it's attacked again, but oh no, wait, hang on. Yeah, what year is this? Right here. Okay, so yes, it has happened. Okay. So it would have been about 10 years ago. I guess I should have double-checked that. There's a lot of little nuances in this talk. About 10 years ago, Sablekk used the children, which he believes are not his, let's say. He thinks that the Golden Endbringer, more or less, which, I mean, again, potato. More or less what happened is during one of the Golden Endbringer attacks, in the aftermath of it, his wife is suddenly pregnant. And then she gives birth to these golden, she's gold as well. She's silver. I thought she was silver. Or no, she's golden. That's right. She's golden, and then she gives birth to like these golden silvery children. So he's kind of like, he's unsure, right? He's like this temporary madness that the Golden Endbringer causes. What was she doing during that time? So he uses his own children as the bait to try to lure in the Endbringer. So he puts his kids out there. They're still rather young. The Endbringer arrives. He does battle with it. Longma unexpectedly shows up as well and joins in on the fight. But then, when the dust settles, Sablekk takes advantage of that help. And both Longma and the Golden Endbringer limp off wounded. So about 10 years ago, Sablekk more or less secured his place as the Lord of the Sea, or at least within his own mind. Of course, all Nair outside of the Empire know that Longma is the true god of the Nair. But Sablekk has proven his supremacy in what a lot of people are calling now the Age of Mortals. This third era is the Age of Mortals, right? The mortals are finally subsuming the powers of the gods themselves. And Sablekk's victory over not only Golden Endbringer, but also Longma is definitely a sign of that. So he, again, is someone who has a lot of power. And the reason I'm talking about him is, again, he rules over an entire province. I know this is a discussion about rulers. But if something were to happen to Varthus unexpectedly, Sablekk is probably the person that would step in to power and become the new Terran Emperor. And he might bring with him another sweeping system of reforms. So he's definitely a person to think about when we're thinking about rulers of the Empire. It's not like it was, where it's just Glacia and then everyone else stinks. There are really multiple rulers at play here in the Empire. And finally, Flasson. Quick notes on him. He was one of the dragon guardians that guarded Vesh'ta's mountains up there in the Grand Tier Peninsula. Again, Vesh'ta was much more insular, and she was concerned about defense. So she had dragons guarding the mountains. One of the dragons, though, named Flasson, grew a taste for ley liners, these magical purple worm-like creatures that inhabit the Horseshoe Plains. Consuming them caused him to grow smarter and smarter and smarter and more innately magical, to the point where the ley liner runes started to show up on his skin and glow on his skin. And he became very powerful and very influential. He created kobolds as like a little subservient little brother race to not just serve him, but also to entertain him as he whiled away the hours in the mountains, being kind of bored. And undermine as well. They undermined an entire section of the mountains as well. But aside from that, he was a bit of a thorn in Vesh'ta's side after a bit because she realized how strong he was becoming, and now he's got all these kobold servants. She wasn't a huge fan of him, but he also wasn't making any direct moves against her power. So she tolerated his presence, but she certainly wasn't happy with this bodyguard of hers, let's say, growing so powerful and popular. Vesh'ta, of course, as we already know, got poisoned and is no longer with us. So when Varthus comes knocking and is like, well, hey, I need someone to rule over the Grantier Peninsula here so I can focus my efforts on what I want to, Flassan's name was on the top of the list of qualified people. So he contacted Flassan, and I mean, hey, a dragon as an imperial governor in the Empire is nothing new, right? So Flassan took the job. And since then, he seems to have more or less continued Vesh'ta's agenda of insularity and keeping to themselves. Not nearly kind of showing the same ambitious political ruthlessness as, say, Varthus or Sablekk. But again, sometimes, or not, I shouldn't say again, I should say, but sometimes that can keep you safe. It means you're not putting a target on your own back. Okay, so that's quite a bit there on Glacia, the original ruler of the Glacian Empire, Vesh'ta, the original queen of the Grantier Peninsula, and then Varthus, Sablekk, and Flassan, the current emperor of the Terran Empire, and then also the provincial governors of those two provinces there.